In this video, we're going to talk about figured bass. Figured bass is a system in which a bass line is written, and underneath the bass line there are a series of numbers and symbols that indicate what the harmony is above that bass line. Now, as early as in the early 1600s, composers were providing figured bass lines for instruments such as clavichord or harpsichord or organ or even lute. And those instruments would take that bass line and those numbers and symbols and actually improvise an accompaniment part using just those figured bass symbols. The way you can think of it is figures above the bass. And what I mean by that is, when you see figured bass, you'll see numbers, and those numbers are indicating intervals, just basic intervals. And those are intervals that are counted above the bass. So it's actually quite simple. Let me give you an example. Here is a C major triad. And you can see that that is in root position. It's written all in thirds, and the root is the lowest pitch. But if you were to count the intervals above the lowest note, you would see the interval of the fifth, and you would see the interval of the third. And this is very typical because figured bass numbers are usually counted starting with a bigger interval and then going on to the smaller interval above the lowest note. If we were to turn this into an inversion, that is, place the root in some upper voice and have the third of the chord as the lowest voice, we could also count those intervals. And we would see the interval of the sixth and the interval of the third. And that would be the figured bass symbol for first inversion. And if we were to do that one more time, that is, place the third in some upper voice and voice the chord so that the fifth of the chord is the lowest pitch, you could see we'd have a different set of numbers. This would be interval of a sixth, this would be the interval of the fourth, and that would be the figured bass for second inversion. Notice we don't try to say anything about the nature of the interval. We don't say major sixth or perfect fourth. We just say 6 and 4, and that means you start on the bottom note and you count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and that tells you all the notes that are involved. What makes this a little bit tricky is that over time these symbols got abbreviated, so that you're not going to see necessarily these symbols written exactly like this, but some shorthand version of it. For example, in root position, it's actually more likely that there's nothing written at all. Instead of writing 5-3, since that's so common, what the composers would do is just write a bass note and write nothing. And then you would assume that it meant 5-3, and you would improvise a root position triad. For first inversion, in a similar way, it would be very typical not to write the 3, just to write the 6, and it would be assumed that it's a 6-3, that those are the numbers intended, and you would perform a chord that had an interval of a sixth above and the interval of a third above, which of course is a first inversion chord with a third in the bass. For the second inversion, it would not be shorthanded. It would be 6-4, and that's what would be written just to avoid ambiguity. So there are your symbols. Nothing for root position, 6 for first inversion with a third in the bass, and 6-4 for second inversion with a fifth in the bass. So what I'd like to do actually at this time is take a look at our theory book, and this will be on page 90. We're going to look at a very basic example, and we'll see how to do this, how to actually what we call realize the figured bass when we see a bass line. So here is the example, page 90. We'll look at this piece right here in the key of C minor. 3 flats, starts on a C, and right away we can see some of the symbols we were just taking a look at. There's the 6-4, and we already said that's a second inversion chord. We see the 6, that's a first inversion chord. And then we see nothing. And the nothing, of course, means that it is a root position triad. So in order to analyze this piece, what we want to do is give ourselves a chart of all the chords in the key of C minor that we can refer to as we're doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in the bass clef. I'm going to write the key signature of C minor, and then I'm going to write the C minor scale. Actually, this is going to be the C harmonic minor scale, because when writing harmonies, it's best to write the harmonic minor scale. And then we'll build a series of triads on each note of the scale. And the chords I've written are the 1 chord. This is the key of C minor, of course. That's a minor triad. We have the 2 chord, which is diminished, the 3 chord, which is major, the 4 chord, which is minor, the 5 chord, which is major actually, because what we need to do is take the leading tone, just as we did in the 7 chord here, that B, turn the B flat into a B natural so that it's harmonic minor. And then the 6 chord, which is major, the 7 chord, which is diminished, and then we get back to the 1 chord, which we don't need to specify. So bringing this example back, I'm going to take my chart of chords and keep it nice and handy so that I can refer to it as I figure out all of the chords that I'm supposed to write here. So first, I see nothing, which means that this is a root position chord and the lowest pitch is C, therefore it's a C chord in root position, and we see from the chart, of course, that that's chord number 1. Now just to keep this nice and clear, I'm going to write the Roman numerals down below on a separate plane here so that I don't get confused with the figured bass symbols. So remember, even though there's no figured bass, it implies 5-3. So look, here's the 5 from the C to the G, and here's the 3 from the C to the E flat. With figured bass, you never add any accidentals or take any accidentals away unless the figured bass is specifically asking you to do that. That's a good thing, because if you think about it, the figured bass is telling you exactly what the chord is. You don't have to harmonize this bass line. It has already been harmonized for you. The figured bass symbols tell you what that harmonization is, what all the notes are. If they want you to raise, flat or sharp or natural a note, they'll tell you exactly what note that they want you to adjust. Let's take a look at the next chord, and it says 6-4. 6-4 means that that is a second inversion chord, and that means that the note I'm looking at is the 5th. So I can look at my chart of chords and see which note has D as a 5th. And I see that right here on the 5 chord. So I'm going to put 5. And of course that's going to be 5-6-4. Now I want to show you another way of doing this. You can do this right on the music here. Since that's the 5th of the chord, I know that because the figured bass tells me that's second inversion. I can say that's the 5th. Then this must be the 3rd, and this must be the root. I can just spell it down like this. The chord, of course, is G, B, D. I want to show you one other thing in this figured bass, and that's the slash that's going through the 6. Whenever they put a diagonal line like that through a number, they're trying to tell you to raise that particular pitch by a half step. So let's see what they're trying to tell us. 6. Let's see if I can figure out what that note is. Here's 1. Remember, you always count that number above the bass. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the B flat. So it's trying to tell you that the B flat needs to be a B natural. So the notes will be G, B natural, and D. Now what the figured bass doesn't tell you, it doesn't tell you exactly what the melody is supposed to be, and it doesn't tell you exactly where those notes are supposed to go. You have to figure out good voice leading, and you have to create a good melody. And that becomes the challenge of realizing figured bass, not really the choice of the pitches. So I'm going to go ahead and voice this. Now, a second inversion major triad should be a chord with a doubled bass. I like to do the doubled note first, so the D, I'll put the other D up here, and then I'll put in the other pitches. Here's the G, and I can put the B natural right here in the tenor. The next chord, 6. That means this is first inversion. That means that note must be the third of the chord because it's the lowest pitch. So I'm going to look for a chord that has E flat as the third. And of course I see that right away. That's a 1 chord. So I'm going to label this as 1, 6. Let me also use my little shorthand method. I'm going to take that note and acknowledge that that's the third of the chord. Well, if that's the third, then the root, of course, would be right here, the 1, and the 5 of the chord would be right there. That's another way to quickly figure out what chord I'm trying to write when I just see a bass note plus a figured bass symbol. So now I'll go ahead and voice that. I'll put my C here. And when I write a major or minor triad in first inversion, I like to try to double the soprano if possible. So the C, I'll put the doubled pitch right here, C, and then G. Okay, the next chord, there's nothing in the figured bass. That's telling me that that's a root position triad and G is the root. So watch me do this. I'll just build it up. That's the root. That's the third. That's the fifth. G, B, D, of course, that's a 5 chord. And then the other thing I have to consider is this accidental. That's just here all by itself. This is something you need to learn about with figured bass. If you see an accidental that does not have a number attached to it, it's just all by itself, then it is referring to the third. And by third, I mean the third note above the bass. In other words, the interval of the third above the bass, not necessarily the third of the chord, because it would depend on the inversion of the chord. But what it means if you take that bass note and count 1, 2, 3, B flat, it's referring to that. So think about that. There's a G, and it wants a B natural, because it needs to natural it, and then a D. So I'm going to write that up here. Notice in both of these chords, the second chord and the fourth chord, I ended up writing a G, B natural, D. And of course, that is the 5 chord in the key of C minor with a raised leading tone. So the figured bass, through these little symbols, is just reminding you to raise the leading tone in the minor key. Let me go ahead and write the B natural up here in the soprano. And then I'll write the G, which is the root tone, in the alto, and then I'll write in the tenor the missing D, the last note of the chord. The next chord, A flat, nothing written. Therefore, that must be the root tone of the chord. My little trick says to go ahead and write the root tone. You can write the third above that and the fifth above that. You would have A flat, C, E flat. There's nothing telling you to change any of those notes. We can see that on my chart right here as the 6 chord. So I'll write 6. Now, be careful. We learned about this. When a 5 chord goes to a 6 chord in a minor key, the voice leading is kind of tough. And it's really easy to write either parallel fifths or parallel octaves or have forbidden intervals. And the way you avoid all of that is to double the third of the 6th chord. So we're going to do that right away. We're going to go ahead and double the third. So my pitches of the 6th chord are A flat, C, and E flat. And I'm going to go ahead and put the C in first. And then I'll go ahead and double the C right here. And then finish with the E flat, like that. The next chord, F, is in the bass, and it says 6. That means that this is a first inversion chord, and that must be the third of the chord. So watch me figure this out. That's the third, so that must be the root, the D, and that must be the fifth, the A flat. D, F, A flat is right here. That's a 2 chord. So this is a 2 diminished 6. And I'll write those notes up here. D, F, A flat. Now because it's a diminished triad, I need to double the bass in this particular chord. So I'm going to do that first. Then I can put my D, which is the root, I'll put it up here. And the A flat, which is the fifth, I can put right down here in the tenor. Next chord is a G, and it says 6, 4. Of course, you know that means second inversion. That means that pitch, that bass pitch, must be the fifth of the chord. If that's the fifth, then G is the fifth, E flat is the third, C is the root. Ah, we recognize that chord. That's just the 1 chord again. So we're going to write 1, 6, 4. And I'm going to go ahead, I can put the root tone right here in the melody. I like to double the bass on a 6/4 chord. You always should do that. So look, I can double it right here. My tenor and my bass can actually sing the same pitch. And the note that I haven't written yet is E flat. I didn't actually write the pitches of that chord here. I could have C, E flat, G. Eventually you won't have to write any pitches above because you'll just be able to keep the names of the notes of the chords in your head as you're doing this. But if you need to do this as you're going along, don't be afraid to do that, to keep track of your notes so that you make sure to harmonize with all of them. And then we have this chord, which is a G with no figured bass. So it's root position, 5/3, with a natural sign. And we remember that the natural sign means to put a natural on the third. So I can see that that's a G. That must be the root. That's the 1, 2, 3 above the bass. It will have a natural. And there's the fifth. That's G, B natural, and D. So I'll put the B natural here in the melody. I'm going to try to write a nice melody like this. And I will put the D here in the alto. And we like to double the bass, of course, in a root position chord. So there's my G, B, D. And we get to the last chord. There's nothing written. So again, this must be a root position chord. That must be the root. Therefore, the root is C. The third is E flat. The fifth is G. It's another 1 chord, C, E flat, G. So I'll finish this piece with a C in the melody, E flat in the alto, and a G in the tenor. And there it is. I've realized my first figured bass. Let's go ahead and give it a listen, see what it sounds like.